Hi everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Harriet Prothero-Sultani, Vice Chair of Momentum, and I'm joined by some really fantastic speakers for tonight's political education session. From the UK, we're going to be joined by Owen Hathaway, author of Militant Modernism, writer and cultural editor of Tribune. From the US, we'll be joined by Taylor Rujo, San Francisco Bay Area tenant attorney who is fighting evictions and landlords and has been for the past 10 years. Tyler is also a homelessness campaigner working on the Hotels Not Hospitals project. So, just to begin, I'm going to give everyone a very quick and brief overview of where we're at in the evictions crisis. So I think there are three key things you need to know. As like a broader context for where we're at and to frame the debate. So some of you may know this, but others may not. Notice periods on evictions will differ according to your devolved government because really boringly, it falls under housing and justice. So for me in Wales, for example, I will have a different notice period to England. But for both England and Wales, the Westminster government has extended the delay on eviction notices issued since September, when the ban on evictions ended until at least March 2021. This is because it's to do with when the courts will hear evictions and it's a non-devolved matter. And then thirdly is that Scotland, because it has its own legal system and its own legislature, is separate altogether. So Scottish comrades will need to look into separate guidance. So just to begin, I wanted to frame with those differences that different people listening will experience. So in March, the courts will start hearing the backlog of eviction notices, which means in March, we're also expecting a wave of evictions to hit our communities, on top of the small number of illegal evictions that have already been taking place. I know we've already seen some in Cardiff, really disgraceful behaviour from some landlords. Anyway, that's why we want to bring you here today, though, is to learn about the history of the UK and the US housing crisis and the current crisis of evictions and how we can organise against it. We want to prep Momentum members with the knowledge of tenant struggle, both locally and internationally. So, enough of me. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Owen Hathaway, who will talk us through the history of the crisis that we see in the UK. Over to you, Owen.
Thanks. It's quite a fun time to be doing this because due to things involving landlords, well, I've not had hot water in my flat for 3 days, so I currently am much better experienced at a distance remotely than I am in close proximity. So I suppose there's a sort of more context to what's happening than a particular discussion of what is currently happening, and hopefully people will kind of come in much more on that later on because it's solutions to things are not always my forte. So I suppose what I think is kind of particularly kind of worth pointing out about the housing crisis in Britain is the fact that it's not something that's natural. It's not something that's kind of happened out of the kind of invisible hand, or has happened accidentally or anything like that. It's something which is wholly political and something which has been, substantially manufactured by the government, and something which is, I think, the kind of terminal point created by, I suppose one way of putting it is the kind of unsolving of the housing question in Britain since the 1980s. So it really, when one sort of reads accounts of housing and housing problems in the early 1980s, they're certainly not non-existent. They certainly exist, but they're of a completely different order. They are not about overcrowding. They're not about landlords. They're not about the expense of housing. They're not about its scarcity. They're very much rather about questions of democracy or questions of aesthetics a lot of the time, which I think now can be slightly kind of infuriating to kind of look at the time. But it's worth kind of looking at kind of housing and a kind of long perspective, so that you can kind of make some sense out of how we got to this point, but B, how we actually know fairly well what the solutions are to the housing crisis, because we've solved it before. And this is a point I think is really, really important, that actually this isn't some sort of like, it's not even that you would, it's not even something that necessarily needs revolutionary solutions, although chance would be a fine thing in terms of the treatment of some landlords. But it's much more something where actually fairly kind of social democratic solutions were applied to it from a period from the 1890s to the 1980s, and had more or less solved the kind of problems that we now face. And we are now back in a situation where kind of problems that were considered to be those of the kind of the Great Depression, or not even of the Great Depression, but problems of the 19th century, have recurred in British cities and are now very, very apparent, particularly in housing lived in the larger cities and by the under 40s. So I suppose, so where I sort of come into this, other than obviously being a tenant, is an interest in kind of housing history and architectural history, and the ways in which kind of social ideas and socialist ideas have been conveyed through that. And here I think the story really starts with something like the Boundary Estate in Shoreditch in East London, which I am going to show a photograph of. So this is more or less, some people in Liverpool would disagree, but more or less the first council housing in Britain. And the kind of backstory to it is interesting for me, because you see the sort of pressures and the sort of forces that were needed to create council housing. And you can also see the things that it succeeded in and the things that initially it failed in. So the Boundary Estate was built by the London County Council, which was set up in 1889. It was built about 3 years later. It was on the site of a slum who had a long list of kind of aristocratic owners. If you kind of look up who actually owned this site in Shoreditch, where the life expectancy at the time was 15 or 16, and you find out that it was sort of owned by, you know, various landed gentry, it will tell you something quite important about the class system. It's also worth looking up today how much is owned by, you know, things like the Duke of Grosvenor. These people are very much still with us. The kind of people that were behind this at the LCC were people who'd been associates of people like William Morris, were kind of, lots of them were on the quite far left, some of them were Marxists, some of them were more kind of soft Fabian socialists. And they used this as a demonstration of what you could do in housing by taking it out of the market. So not only was the housing let outside of the housing market completely, let by the local authority, it was also built by the local authority and built at union rates by a union-controlled municipal building company. And that was a really crucial thing. And they ended up getting taken through the courts for several years, basically, because of this, because this was considered at the time to be tantamount to communism. So this still stands. It's still council housing. It's still very popular council housing. And it kind of, on one level, it kind of proved the point that you could take housing out of the market and you can make it every bit as good as what you were getting in the private market. But the main flaw of it, which is worth pointing out when talking about evictions, is that a huge amount of the people that were moved out of that slum did not get to return to it. I think only about 20 families of the hundreds that were cleared actually managed to come back. That's largely because the rents were very high. And the reason why the rents were very high was to pay off the people who owned the site, who the LCC had to buy it off. So this kind of sets a trend which kind of stays for lots of the next kind of 30 years, where council housing is built in quite large numbers, but built very much for the so-called deserving poor. And you still have kind of major problems with homelessness. You still have major problems with slum housing and with landlordism. And the thing that really finishes that off is the Second World War. And there's a lot of interesting kind of ways of looking at that through the kind of prism of tenants activism. One thing that a lot of people forget is that the Second World War saw a wave of squatting and a wave of occupations. much of the First World War saw a lot of rent strikes in places like Glasgow. And council housing after the Second World War is seen in this quite different way, not as a kind of special housing for kind of skilled workers, but as housing for absolutely anyone. And there's a kind of initial plan, which isn't in any way actually acted upon, of nationalising land in order to kind of, completely erase landlordism from British life. Some of this ended up getting criticised by some on the left, but there's a phrase from Colin Ward about municipal landlordism. I think, having experienced municipal landlordism and landlordism, I think it's fair to say that municipal landlordism is preferable. But I think that kind of also misses the really important part of this, which is that it was an effort to decommodify housing and to take it out of the market completely. And obviously, there's kind of various kind of interpretations of this, various sorts of radicalism that are kind of happening at the time. But the kind of architect and thinker who probably exemplifies this moment best is the Soviet emigre and communist Bertolt Lubetkin, who designed several council housing schemes in what was then London boroughs, metropolitan boroughs of Finsbury and Bethnal Green, motivated in some ways by his kind of engagement with revolutionary art and sculpture and so on after the Russian Revolution, but also by this conviction that, quote, nothing is too good for ordinary people. So this is the staircase in a block called Bevin Court, which was originally Lenin Court because it was around the corner from where Lenin had lived in London. They had to hastily change that around the time NATO was formed, and it got named after the founder of NATO. Allegedly, the Lenin bust, which Lubetkin had also designed, is in the sort of buried underneath the staircase. But this is very much part of this moment of housing being about, kind of, to use the phrase that was often used at the time, light, air, and openness. So rather than it being about kind of maximizing profit on particular small sites, it became very much more about working out needs, working out what was considered at the time to be needs, rather than questions which came in much later on about control and so on. A lot of the criticism of this stuff after 1968 hinges on, I suppose, the kind of expansion of interest out of kind of just pure need of, like, do you have an affordable home that you are not going to be evicted from, that you get plenty of light and plenty of air, and has electric central heating and so forth, and a balcony or a garden. That ceases to be the measure, and instead there's much more of a question about not ownership as such, but questions of racial politics in one respect, in questions of tenant control. And here the really interesting example for me is Broadwater Farm in Tottenham, an enormously misunderstood estate which was built by Haringey Council in the late 60s and early 70s. And by the end of the 1970s, it, reflecting lots of the area, had a fairly sort of equal balance between white tenants and black tenants. And that was not reflected in the estate's community organisations, which at that point were about 99% white. And it was not reflected in the policing of the area, which was notoriously aggressive and culminating notoriously in the death of one of the tenants at the hands of the police, leading in turn to the riots in 1985. But what I want to talk about with Broadwater Farm is the way in which it ended up in the course of the 1980s being redesigned by its residents. So this is kind of where it stands in Tottenham, where the kind of suburban area around it kind of meets it. And you can see one of the several murals that were put there. But really much more important than the kind of program of murals, and in a way the kind of removal of walkways that happened at the same time, was the fact that there was a prolonged campaign in that state for racial justice, which was substantially successful. And it's now gone from an area that was considered, sort of hard to let, to use the cliche of the time, so now one where there's an enormous waiting list of people wanting to be housed on it. So for me, a lot of kind of, in some ways you can see this as a moment in which a lot of basically the housing problems in Britain had been substantially solved. There was obviously pockets of homelessness, pockets of rough sleeping, pockets of landlordism. But in big cities, you had usually half or more of people were council tenants and had secure, well-built, decent housing. And the process by which this was sort of eroded really starts from a kind of, in a way, a recognition of this critique of so-called municipal landlordism and the introduction of the right to buy council housing. And there have been experiments with the right to buy before, and some countries that have a lot of council housing have had kind of the right to buy for a while. What was important in Britain was the way it was combined with a full frontal attack on council housing itself, which was starved of funds, where the funds raised from the receipts were not reinvested, and where the housing that was bought was heavily subsidized. So we're talking about, houses were offered for sale to the tenants for about a fifth of their value. So it was a specific way of kind of crushing the power of local authorities to build and maintain their housing. And it had the effect that whereas a lot of younger people would have moved into council housing, regardless of whether or not they were, in dire need or not, it would just be a normal thing that people would do a lot of the time. It became residualized. And it's interesting, one of Sam Wetherell's recent book, Foundations, goes into a lot of detail about how that residualizing actually had an effect of making estates a lot more racially segregated than they were previously. But so within that, we kind of ended up creating, after a fashion, a kind of landlord's paradise in the UK, where tenants had very, very few rights, thanks to the assured short-hold tenancies that were brought in by Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s, by the phasing out of rent tribunals, which I think still have some nominal legal existence, but really it's not something which people have real recourse to, by the abolition by Thatcher of rent controls in cities, and by the effective abolition of council housing, which still exists as a sort of rump, and lots of it now owned by housing associations, but has hugely declined in its numbers at the same time that the numbers of private renters have risen massively. So a lot of the kind of things that can be seen as these kind of like sort of typologies that have emerged out of the types of buildings that have emerged that are really quite grotesque, huge quantities of so-called beds and sheds, of sort of endemic sofa surfing, of, the student housing blocks built after the liberalization of education in the late 90s, which tend to be enormously badly built and pokey and hugely expensive. And obviously in the scandalous cladding of various post-war council blocks with unsafe materials, leading to the Grenfell Tower disaster, which is now increased. Sort of recent statistics suggesting that over 90% of buildings that were clad unsafely in that period. And the kind of the new Labour kind of moment really did not significantly dent this. It slowed the right to buy in some degrees, but it also kind of intensified this pressure in a lot of other places, particularly outside of London, by introducing the so-called Pathfinder scheme, which, to give it its full name, Housing Market Renewal Pathfinders, which involved demolishing huge swathes of perfectly viable housing in order to create a housing market, because you create a housing market by creating scarcity. So they demolished a lot of good housing and created a housing crisis. Wonderful. Good lads. I always think of them as comrades. So that, that kind of mess is the one that we're in, very much the one that we're in now. And in some ways, there's been a sort of gradual recognition of the possible solutions to this, which was very, very lacking in the 2000s, for instance, when council housing was still seen as a problem, including by a lot of Labour councils. I mean, there was some movement. One of the things where I would credit New Labour on something was on homelessness, where rough sleeping at least was very significantly reduced. It was very high in the 1990s, not that it's very high now, but they've managed to reduce it. That aside, they were terrible on housing. I think that's literally the only thing where I'd give them any credit whatsoever. But there is now a certain amount of acknowledgement that council housing is necessary. It's being built in some cities, some of it very good, in Norwich, in Bristol, proposals in Salford. But the mess that's been created is so enormous that the kind of length of time it would need to unfuck it, as it were, is vast. And I think on that, obviously, renters' unions have a significant part to play. Conceivably, although you need to be very, very sure that you've got a chance of winning with something like this, rent strikes would be a thing that would have a part to play, and the sort of widespread acknowledgement that this is the fundamental problem would also have a part to play. But I think a lot of councils could be kind of pushed or swayed or kind of made more sympathetic, whereas some are still kind of locked into a 1997 mindset and are completely impossible to kind of shift in any way. But I think pretty much the only kind of optimistic way of looking at it I can think of is that whereas about 15 years ago everyone pretended there wasn't a problem, now there very much obviously is. And even people that are very much in the political centre will acknowledge that there is. And that's the sort of first step on the way to actually bring people with you. Anyway, I hope that's been at least of some use. And I'll leave it to everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much. When you're speaking, I just want to rage. I just get so angry at like the concept we've been completely failed by local Labour councils, by Labour governments. Oh, it fills me with rage. Anyway, thank you so much, Owen. And nothing is too good for ordinary people. So we are just going to move on to our next speaker. I'm really excited to listen to Tyler Rujo, because Tyler's going to talk from some of his experiences as an attorney and activist in the San Francisco Bay area. And I'm really excited to hear the differences or similarities. Just tell us everything.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll go through as much as I can. My name is Tyler Rujo. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk. As was mentioned, I'm an eviction defense attorney in San Francisco. I've been doing this work for about 10 years or so. I'm a radical socialist. Won't go into other specifics since I think this is being recorded, but just for people's frame of reference. In addition to my work as an attorney, in which I defend tenants' rights, both from eviction and suing landlords, etc., I'm an organizer, as I think was mentioned before, with a project called Hotels Not Hospitals. It's a political project raising community-donated funds to rent hotel rooms for people experiencing homelessness during the pandemic. We agitate for policy solutions and work to develop a community-supported housing model and generally try to build power from the ground up against the criminalization of poverty and for housing as a right, not a commodity for profit. So with kind of that in mind, I wanted to give my perspective as a tenant attorney, somebody living in San Francisco, on this eviction crisis, which is looming, across the United States, in San Francisco, in California, in the UK, elsewhere. And note when we're talking about this, or when I'm talking about this, the homelessness crisis, which is very acute in San Francisco, is part of the housing crisis, and that was mentioned earlier. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Here in San Francisco and elsewhere, they're too often treated as different fights and different crises, when really they have like the same root causes, in my view. Tenant issues around housing and people who are excluded from housing are really suffering from the same systemic, the same institutions, the same interests are keeping people excluded from housing and pushing people out of housing, certainly here in San Francisco. In my view, the root cause of this crisis is the commodification housing and control by capital for profit, rather than its allocation and use to people to meet the human need for shelter and health. Here in San Francisco, we have tens of thousands of vacant housing units and somewhere around 8,000 to 5,000 people who are unhoused right now, tonight or today. So the problem isn't really the lack of housing, but the social system that excludes people from housing on a daily basis. Evictions, when evictions happen, in my experience, seeing this, kind of close up, tenants become unhoused in some instances. Some instances they move into other housing. But when tenants move from being housed to unhoused, the larger society starts to treat people differently, right? Around 70%, around 70%, the last count I saw, of people who are unhoused in San Francisco right now were previously housed in San Francisco. And then when you pass through that transition, so you're no longer a tenant fighting for your home, but now you're excluded from a home, you're treated much differently by the larger society. And I think it's important to keep an eye on that. I'm going to kind of address that. So that's my pitch for uniting these fights. In San Francisco, specifically California generally, we have very extreme wealth disparities, right? So we have an staggering accumulation of wealth in San Francisco, right next to extreme poverty. We're only 7 miles by 7 miles in San Francisco, so things are crammed pretty tightly together here in the city. To justify this situation, that people are confronted with, regular people generally, there's a mentality that people blame poor people for their situation, unhoused people for being unhoused, blame tenants fighting their eviction. Somehow they've done something wrong. This is really acute in the unhoused, in the homeless context, where people routinely face harassment, hostility, and hate just for existing, just for being poor and not having housing. It's, in my view, regular folks are reminded of this reality that they'd rather not acknowledge. And so something happens where they externalize it and say, oh, that person must have done something wrong. Our system, it's not the system's fault, it's that person. And that sometimes takes the form of violence and demonization, all too often. So, I think this dynamic that I see in my work and I've experienced personally also happens in the tenant fight, right? So I think it's important to keep that dynamic, because in the unhoused and the homeless context, it's maybe more extreme and more easy to see that somebody is just being demonized and the victim of violence because of their poverty. But it also occurs to a lesser extent, in my experience, in fighting evictions. So I primarily defend tenants who are facing eviction for what are called no-fault evictions. I do all sorts of eviction defense, but primarily here in San Francisco, one of the drivers of eviction is to flip housing. We have rent control. Rent is very expensive, but if you've lived in your unit for a long time, then it's going to be significantly below market rent. And there's so much money to be made in housing in San Francisco that, capital comes from all around the world to San Francisco to buy up tenant-occupied buildings, to flip it, to make huge profit. There's just so much money to be made. And in this work defending evictions, there's oftentimes this belief that even when there's no allegation of the tenant not paying rent or breaching the contract or things of that nature, the tenant has done something wrong, that fighting the eviction is bad, right? I hear this from tenants themselves who have lived in units for a number of years, come in and say things like, well, it's the landlord's property, so the landlord can do what he wants with it. Even when it's, somebody who's lived in the property for a long time and it's some corporation that just bought the building and now they want to flip it. There's still this internalized dynamic of, well, it's their property, they can do what they want with it, as opposed to, oh, it's my home, I just want to stay here and live and, raise my family, or, whatever it is, I just want to have a home. There's oftentimes a resistance to, when these two things come in conflict, that it's okay or that it's right, that you have a moral or ethical or whatever legitimate right to your home when there's a holder of legal title trying to push you out. That the legal system says, without getting into like the technicalities of eviction defense and all of that, but generally, unless there's some defense, the owner of title is entitled to get the tenant out because they hold that private property, right? So they have that interest to come in and dispossess somebody of their home. That's the norm, and it's internalized in our thinking. So to get tenants to fight, takes a little bit of coaxing. I mean, that's not my role as an attorney, but I'm also like an activist and an organizer. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind while we're doing this work. So just to give a little, I guess, context for the current eviction crisis, we have, it was interesting to hear a moment ago kind of the different histories and context for municipal housing or public housing and private housing market here in San Francisco, in the United States generally. We don't have much public housing. Municipal housing. It's pretty much all been privatized. There was a big push, I don't know, it's like 40 years ago or so, to privatize a lot of the public housing. The federal government doesn't put much through HUD, which is the federal agency that runs public housing throughout the country. A lot of the housing kind of been let go into disrepair and then moved out through the legal programs that were put in place to essentially privatize. And in San Francisco particularly, I believe the public housing agency is still bankrupt. It went bankrupt a few years ago and basically doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything legitimate. I don't know what exactly people who work there are doing, but we have nonprofits that run what would be otherwise some sort of municipal or below market housing. Some of it's in just the straight private market, but we have kind of a industry of nonprofits that do a number of things in San Francisco. One of the things that they've done is they've privatized what would be municipal housing or public housing, and it's being run by these nonprofit entities. So you have nonprofit landlords. And prior to the current crisis, these nonprofits were, and I believe still are, the largest evictors in the city for a number of reasons. But it's not a situation where the fundamental dynamic has changed here. In my experience, you still have the profit motive is still there. It's just kind of masked. That's my take on it. The tenants in housing and the nonprofit housing here don't seem to be empowered. There's still the same dynamic of landlords wanting the units for use as they would like to see it, as opposed to the tenants, self-managing any sort of housing. We have recently in San Francisco, this is just kind of a little background for the political context here. We passed a proposition for building more municipal housing. So we have restrictions. Basically, it's illegal under the state constitution for cities to build any sort of public housing, unless it's approved by the voters. So we went to the voters here and got approval to build more housing. And now we're setting ourselves up for this fight with the political group that we generally call, or they self-identify as YIMBYs, who want to build more and more housing, and maybe more people on the left and socialists who would like to have decommodified housing. There's a number of people here that are engaged in that sort of political fight over, well, how's this housing going to be built? That has yet to be determined. But there's a large narrative here that the housing crisis, which everybody acknowledges is a crisis and has been for a number of years and continues to get worse. There's a number of people that say, well, we don't have enough housing. We need to build more housing, and it's the restriction on building more housing that's causing the crisis. And in my view, that's simply incorrect. We have tens of thousands, if not 100,000 plus vacant units right now. The problem is that it's not allocated based on need. It's allocated on based on who has money and how to make profit. And people don't have money to pay for it, then they're not able to access it. So it's not a problem of we need to build more housing, is that we need to take housing off of the market. And the only way I see that to happen is through the ground up, not through the state, but we'll get to that, I guess, in a second. That's just my personal take. I'm going to give you my little pitch on that point right now. I'm talking to a group of socialists, I imagine, so I probably don't need to stress the point, but the legal system, the norms that we have legitimize the rule of capital. In the current eviction crisis, I think we have an opportunity to legitimize a new norm. And the issue that I see is this problem of the legitimacy of one to their own home or to housing in general. Under the law as it exists, a landlord's right to profit wins when a tenant's right to their home and the landlord's right to profit come in conflict. So I see when we have 40 million households in the United States facing eviction within the next month or two, we have an opportunity, potentially, to create a new norm. If the facts on the ground change such that these landlords can't evict these tens of millions of tenants in the next year, the system will internalize that fact. If we were able to mobilize, and I don't think that we're there by any stretch, but if we were able to mass mobilize people to prevent these evictions, there would be some mechanism whereby the legal system would say, okay, in these sort of circumstances, people have a right to their housing, because you're not going to somehow the law has to accept the way things are. That's the way that it operates. So if in this circumstance, we were able to stop these mass evictions, I think the right to housing, as it exists in the UN Declaration of Human Rights or any law that was passed to recognize it, could in fact become a reality. But it would have to change in that manner. We'd have to actually change the facts on the ground and have that power in order for the system to accept it. Otherwise, what's most likely is landlord bailout. So, the major source of the current crisis, where we have tens of millions of people in the United States facing eviction, is the coronavirus pandemic and the loss of wages and employment. Tens of millions of people lost their work and have been unable to pay rent. So people lose their job, aren't able to pay their landlords, don't get little or nothing in social assistance, and they're facing eviction, or some homeowners are facing foreclosure from the banks. So as you've probably seen there, landlords have continued to try to displace and have successfully displaced and evicted people here in San Francisco and elsewhere. Throughout this entire period, there's been certain types of evictions that have gone forward. We've had some moratoriums that have limited some evictions, but others have continued. So for instance, the Ellis Act was never limited. The Ellis Act is basically a tool for speculators in California to buy buildings and then evict everybody in the building to take it off the rental market, which it usually means to sell it as TICs or tenancies in common afterwards. I've seen a number of cases since the coronavirus, just anecdotal, but where landlords are changing the locks on tenants are manufacturing facts, are coming up with lies and excuses to get tenants out because there have been some limitations on their right to dispossess. And I think that is not super surprising, just based on my work. It's not unusual that landlords who feel entitled to get tenants out, and that's a very strong mentality, that if the law says I can't do it that way, then I'm just going to do it another way. I'm just going to shut off the utilities. I'm just going to change the locks. I'm just going to say that they're doing something, and that's all illegal, right? But it still happens. So in March 2020, we had the shelter in place order due to coronavirus. The evictions continued despite the shelter in place. In mid-March, I was in the courthouse here in an eviction case, and there was an attorney who was escorted out because of some close contact with COVID. And it was a packed courtroom. The judge, told the bailiff to escort the person out, and then brought everybody back. And then we continued the rest of the eviction calendar for the rest of the afternoon, where we were all there together. It was pretty surreal in March of 2020, when everybody's being told to stay home because of this, new deadly pandemic, and the eviction courts kept rolling, and tenants were still being displaced out of their homes. The order in San Francisco said that people who were unhoused, were sleeping on the street, were exempt from the order. And there was just a huge disconnect between there always is, but it was just very, very acute at that time. So a few days later, a group of eviction defense attorneys, including myself, filed some ex parte applications, went to the court, and asked the judge to stay to temporarily halt our eviction cases. And we had the press there, not in the courtroom, but for the whole kind of outside the courthouse. So we spoke to the press, we filed these motions, and tried to have a united front of eviction defense attorneys to at least put a temporary halt, because it was clear that the court was unable to deal with the pandemic, and we wanted to keep our clients housed. A few days later, the San Francisco Superior Court shut down. Didn't completely shut down, but pretty much halted the evictions and delayed all of the proceedings in the courthouse. So I would say it was, relatively successful. That was independent of the action of the legislature, of the city council, or board of supervisors technically, that had passed a moratorium. So there's a moratorium in place, but it wasn't impacting the ongoing displacement and evictions. So it actually took our effort in the court, in the legal kind of arena, with some public pressure, to get the presiding judge of the court to, what they did was they requested permission from the state Supreme Court to temporarily shut it down. Shortly thereafter, the California Supreme Court Judicial Council issued emergency orders staying evictions. And from, I believe that was in March, near the end of March 2020, for the next few months, landlords couldn't get new summonses on eviction cases. And that's really what halted, I would say, tens of thousands of evictions during the summer. It wasn't what the local jurisdictions did. It wasn't what the state legislature did. It certainly wasn't what the federal government did. It was the courts saying, we need to put a hold on this. And, there's that good for them. I wish they would have done more. But from my perspective, that was the biggest aid to tenants during the summer was the state judicial council putting that stay. I listened to another legal advocate speak, I think during the summer, not in the eviction defense context, but she had mentioned that there were similar actions that courts took, and that her and a number of other legal advocates had breathed a sigh of relief when the courts temporarily shut down, and that it would be good to, that she recommended people reflect on that. And, I think that it's obvious maybe to me and to other radicals and socialists that the legal system serves the powerful, right? We try to use it to the advantage of people, everyday people or tenants, criminal defendants, etc. But by and large, it's a tool of oppression. It's not a means of liberation. So if we in this context are breathing a sigh of relief when the system at least temporarily slows down or stops, like, what does that mean? Like, what are we actually doing in this work? I thought that was a little useful tidbit. So when the courts, they didn't keep the stay forever. Basically the courts here in California said, okay, this is an issue for the legislature. They didn't want to. They got a lot of pressure from the real estate lobby, which is very powerful and basically runs Sacramento, the state legislature here and in San Francisco. Very powerful lobby. They have huge amounts of money. So the courts deferred and said, okay, we're going to lift this. And when it was lifted, there was a patchwork of moratoriums in place. We had a state moratorium, we had local moratorium, and then later the feds came in. And most of it has been around the non-payment of rent. There's been some other limitations as well. But, similar to maybe how it is over there, the legal grounds for eviction, it's run through the state. The state legal system is all a little different. It's not run by the feds. And some places have stronger tenant protection, some have weaker. But the major, I would say the majority of the 40 million approximate households facing eviction in the country, in the US, is based on non-payment of rent. The failure to, they owe back rent. I think in California, it's like $17 billion is owed by California tenants. And that's like, I think I don't remember the number. I think it's 2 million. I have it here somewhere. Households I've got 1.3 billion households in California owing 7.2 billion in back rent, according to the state legislature. So that's the situation here right now. And currently, kind of flash forward a little bit, Trump's CDC issued an order, I think it's September, October, staying non-payment of rent evictions through December. And, a number of people have been evicted regardless of that. It's been a pretty weak order. It was strong language, and then their Department of Justice backed off of it. But that expires at the end of the year. And without any other action, you've got tens of millions of people that would be facing eviction. The state here in California passed a moratorium in September and preempted all of the local jurisdictions, saying that you can't be evicted for non-payment of rent, with several conditions I don't need to go into, and that expires at the end of January. So beginning in February, unless they do something in the next month, you have tens of millions of tenants, I would, just based on my estimate, facing eviction. Certainly a lot of people facing eviction. It's unclear what's going to happen with that. I think they'll probably kick the can down the road for those evictions. We have a couple of bills that are we have a couple of bills that are in the legislature. I'm being told that I'm running low on time. That will basically kick the can down the road. So let me talk about what we're trying to do in organizing some sort of resistance to this. We've seen a number of tenant councils pop up, which are organizations of tenants who have the same landlord. So, I get together with my neighbor and we talk about our common situation, and we form a tenant council in a building. And then those tenant council, that organization connects with other buildings who have the same landlord. We've seen that pop up, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we're relatively tenant friendly, or already have a good deal of tenant consciousness. Those things are popping up. Eviction defense networks are popping up. I think that is the most needed. In my work, there's people who come out in solidarity to help tenants who are facing eviction, but it's very difficult once the sheriff gets there. Right now we have a moratorium on sheriffs evicting, to stop that eviction. We've seen it in Philadelphia, we've seen it in Los Angeles, we've seen it in Oakland and in Portland. It's happening. There needs to be more of that, in my opinion, and it is starting to get organized more and more. It's hopefully that consciousness of people to recognize that it's not legitimate for landlords to dispossess tenants of their property just because they hold legal title to it. If that consciousness starts to get raised in people, and they start to actually stand outside when the sheriff comes to evict you from your homes, then we can really change that dynamic. And it's starting to happen, and we're starting to build those networks. But it's a short amount of time to build an infrastructure like that. More likely what's going to happen is the state legislature is going to pass something that's going to defer the rent for another few months, put up some amount of money, and bail out the landlords. And that's the way that I see the system not displacing tens of millions of people. Because if they tried to do that, I think it would be a crisis that we haven't seen, at least on a scale that we haven't seen in my memory, of those amount of people to be displaced. The system can accommodate a slow trickling of atrocities. Every day just is mundane and we just accept it. But just on this date, okay, now 10 million people are out. I think I don't see it happening. So something's got to give. If we can grow these networks that we have here in the Bay Area, where people will mobilize to fight the evictions on the ground after it runs through the court system. If the tenants are unable to prevail, then we can change that dynamic. And that's the work that is being done right now, as well as lobbying for some better bailout from the legislature. So I kind of skipped over a few different points because I was running a little bit over. We've got 25% of renters in the Western states, which is, Pacific Coast, have no confidence in being able to pay rent. We have bills that were introduced this month in California that would extend the moratorium through either March of this year or through 2021. And as socialists, I think we're doing two things at once. We are we're trying to get our representatives or the state to pass some law to allow tenants to remain in their homes and then figure it out. And then we're also trying to organize tenants and regular folks to build power, in solidarity with each other in our communities, so that we're not going to accept our neighbor being kicked out of their home, that we're going to go out there physically or in some manner and prevent that from happening. But that's tedious, grueling work, I suppose. We have a long way to go, but that's the sort of work that's being done right now.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was very, very interesting. And I definitely want to come to San Fran now and start organizing with you. Like, I'm getting on the next plane. When I can get on a plane, I'm coming. And me and you, we're going to go around and we're going to organize. I can't wait. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. And I just wanted to agree with you on some of the things you said about landlords changing locks and coming up with excuses. It's been quite interesting to see how creative landlords can get in the UK, to be honest. Some of the excuses they're coming up with, even though there's an eviction ban on. And and as you mentioned, no-fault eviction is a huge problem for us here in the UK too. It's something that Momentum are aiming to campaign around scrapping. I mean, it was literally in the Queen's speech for us here. So, you know, we'll see what the Tories do on that. Anyway, thank you so much for speaking. That was really, really helpful. I've got loads of messages from friends being like, oh my gosh, Tyler's amazing. So just, you know.
Great. Well, I'm glad.
Fab. I'm just going to move on to what Momentum is doing at the moment and give a bit of an update on where the Eviction Resistance campaign is at. But before I do that, I wanted to share a few reflections myself, actually, on some of the housing crisis. So, as you can probably tell by this accent, I grew up in the valleys, where most of the housing stock was former state housing and then turned private and right to buy. But ever since I left the valleys in 2016, I've rented and I have moved into a different house for the last 10 years. I've moved every 10 years. Like, no, wait, every 10 years? I moved house every year for 10 years. Like, every 10 years would be fine, Harriet. Shut up. Anyway, I've probably had more landlords than Keir Starmer has gone back on his policy promises. And at my age, you know, I'm forced into this power relationship between me and my landlord. And I think it's been a radicalizing experience for many. Many of my flatmates who haven't considered themselves political have been drawn into politics through experiencing and seeing how tenants are, to put it politely, crapped on by their landlords. And the amount of injustice in the system that is becoming so obvious to people, people can't not be politicised by it. And this is what I see through work with the local Acorn branch as well, is that the attitude of estate agents towards Acorn like never ceases to amaze me. Estate agents telling tenants when they come up and state their rights that they ought to like check their attitude and be like would do well to speak better to estate agents. And you're like, what on earth? It doesn't amaze me anymore, but it does baffle me. And I have to like remind tenants sometimes that it's not a crime or a civil offence to ask for your rights, no matter how scary it is to do that. We're always trying to remind renters, you know, that they have the power if they choose to use it and get organised, not these poxy estate agents. Anyway, rant over. As a Momentum NCG member, I'm extremely keen to work out how as socialists we can get organised ourselves and mobilised in support of tenants unions such as Acorn, London Renters Union and other unions across the UK to play a part in dealing with the crisis. In fact, it's one of the key commitments that I stood on in the NCG election. So let me tell you how to get organised in the Momentum Eviction Resistance campaign. Let's do it. Buckle up. Okay, so what has happened so far? We have formed 30 eviction resistance groups across the country, and we've been gearing up to mobilise in support of tenants' unions when the eviction ban hits. We've run training with over 100 Momentum members from across the country on how to resist evictions with the help of the fantastic London Renters Union. Action groups have mobilised to support tenants' unions physically resisting evictions in Bromley, Tower Hamlets and Haringey. And we've also passed a wave of motions in our CLPs to put pressure on the party internally to take more pro-tenants positions by extending the eviction ban, forgiving pandemic rent debts and extending Section 21. Just as Tyler said then about a landlord bailout, one of the most shocking things to me in this whole crisis has been when the government, like on day one, decided that landlords could have a mortgage holiday, but tenants didn't have that luxury afforded to them. We were still asked to pay rent, even though the landlord wasn't asked to pay their mortgage. So if you ever wanted to understand the power relationship of a tenant and a landlord, there you go. It's just blatantly in front of you. So, in terms of the eviction resistance campaign, the plans for the new year, the key elements of the campaign, there are 4, so I'm just going to run through them quickly, okay? The first one is to mobilise to support tenants' unions in resisting evictions as and when they occur, especially from March when we expect these to increase dramatically. Secondly is to organise our own political direct actions and protests in February and March to put pressure on landlords and the government to halt the wave of evictions before it starts. Thirdly is to shift the Labour Party to support renters. Fourthly, developed increased coordination across action groups to build a basis for a longer-term political work that Momentum can do around housing issues, such as, widespread political education led by members in communities. So to break it down for you folks, for what you can expect over the next 4 or 5 months from Momentum, is that in January, we are going to be, due to the COVID restrictions we imagine are going to be in place, this is going to be like our prep month. We'll be continuing to phone bank members in our areas and get them to join the local action groups that we've set up and to sign up to tenants unions where they aren't already members. We'll be holding a big meeting in January for those action group leads and anyone interested, any interested members to talk through a plan about political direct action for February and March. So please watch this space. Our research team has been doing some fantastic work, mapping out targets across the country who we can put pressure on. Like, props to the research team. You've been absolutely amazing. So we'll be sharing this as well and working with action groups to refine this and identify targets in the local areas. So looking at the research and trying to work out, say for a group in Cardiff or Liverpool, who those main targets would be. We aim to be running also political education on the history of the Labour Party's policy on tenants' rights. That'll be fascinating. So we can look from Keir Hardie to Thangam Debonair. We can see specifically where party policy has been and where we need to go. And then Momentum as a whole will be running a democratic process for members to decide what policies we campaign on for the next year at Labour Party conference. So we'll be encouraging action groups to consider if we want to push some key interventions on housing at conference. That was just January. February would be our direct action month. We will identify some key targets in the government and the real estate industry and work with action groups to organise a day of action involving protest and direct actions to pressure politicians and landlords to halt the coming wave of evictions. During this action month, we'll be lobbying political representatives in the party too, so we tie them into the noise that we're making. In March, this will be the month that the 6-month stay on eviction notices ends. So we will have a second day of action this month to up the pressure. We'll need to be very responsive and put pressure on the Labour Party wherever we can. We will need to find what the landscape is like at this point and how fast the evictions are coming and what the tenants unions are doing. But this is going to be a big month for us in March. Because obviously we're going to see the evictions pick up and we'll start doing whatever we can to mobilise support for the tenants unions on the front line of eviction, resisting evictions. Sorry, my phone just went off. In April, I'm nearly done, we will continue mobilising to support tenants unions and send in all Momentum members to their local tenants unions to physically resist those evictions. So just like Tyler was talking about then, getting people to physically turn up and resist the bailiffs or the sheriffs in the States. And if you don't have a tenants union branch in your area, then it's really worth trying to set one up. Join up with the relevant union in your area, get some friends and comrades involved with you, and then you have the basis of the team, and get in touch with the tenants union to find out the next steps. Right. That was a lot. How you can get involved, though, is that we need you to put as much pressure before March, okay? We need everyone to be phone banking their local members to see if they want to join a local eviction resistance action group and encourage them to sign up to a tenants union too. Please, if you don't already have a tenant union branch in your area, try to get organised and get in touch with relevant tenants to set one up. If you do have a branch locally, then please do link your eviction resistance group up with them and save the evening of the 13th of January in your diary for January planning. Also, you can check out via mycampaignmap.com, which is on the screen actually. Beautiful, seamless. You can go to this website here for all of the full information. So apparently I froze, so I'm just repeating. Please check out my campaign map, which is coming across the bottom of the screen for further detail. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to both our speakers, Owen and Tyler. This has been really, really interesting, and I'm very inspired and also very angry. But thank you all so much for coming tonight.
Nobody said that this would be easy.
When you're trying to reverse decades of privatisation and fighting to take our services back into public hands, it doesn't just happen overnight.
When you're demanding that billionaires pay more taxes, the billionaires that run the right-wing press will attack you.
When you are taking on the big corporations and powerful individuals who've amassed obscene wealth by wrecking the climate, they will fight back.
When you're taking on the bosses demanding fair wages and workers' rights, they'll do all that they can to keep you down.
And when you're fighting for politics to be more open and democratic, the establishment will do everything they can to stop you.
As I know only too well.
But this isn't anything new. The rich and the powerful will always fight to protect their interests.
So why would you give up fighting for yours?
I've been a Labour Party member for 40 years. Yeah, sometimes it's been tough.
Even when there was only a few of us, keeping alive the flame of socialism in our party and in the Labour movement, I never gave up.
And there are many reasons to be hopeful.
Ideas like public ownership and a Green New Deal that were once considered extreme are now Labour Party policy.
I see communities organising together like never before, working together to change society for the better.
And now there are more left socialist MPs than there have been for decades.
In the past, Labour left members with socialist politics like mine found it almost impossible to become an MP. But through grassroots members fighting for socialism, I won my selection and became the Labour MP for Streatham.
Now from within the Labour Party, from the Houses of Parliament, I'm giving a voice to the Labour Party members who put me there and to the communities I represent.
Socialism won't happen overnight.
The leadership of the Labour Party may have changed, but our goals have not.
Together, we can and we will build a movement.
One that fights the daily injustices in our workplaces and communities and works to shape the future of our party.
That's what we'll do as MPs.
That's what we'll do as Momentum.
Join Labour.
Join Momentum.
Let's build towards socialism.